very brutal story, really. The Algonquins were moved out of the Ottawa Valley at a very early stage. A lot of them, as they were displaced, were gathered either in Montreal, or the priests took them to Oka, and they were living in Montreal. And any who were not displaced were treated as if they were squatters, as the loggers moved into the Ottawa Valley. And in 1851, they founded, the priests and the government, between them, founded this reserve at Maniwaki, which was called the River Desert Reserve at that time, and at Temiskaming. And the idea was that all Algonquins were supposed to go to Maniwaki. It was a big reserve. And in other words, get them out of the way so that the loggers could get on with stripping the country of what they wanted. The northern Algonquins never went to Maniwaki. I asked them once at Barriere Lake, why didn't they go? And they said, well, it was a long journey. It took them 2 weeks in canoe, and they tried to go in 1851, and the people who went got smallpox, and thereafter they decided not to go.
The Algonquin Nation occupied historically the Ottawa Valley from the headwaters of the Ottawa River right through into both sides of the Ottawa River, Ontario and Quebec. And the headwaters of the Ottawa River are up where Barriere Lake is. They're at the very headwaters of the Ottawa River. Their cultural values, cultural ways, much of the Algonquin Nation had been displaced because of the proximity to settlement. Their area in the Ottawa Valley, we're in the Ottawa Valley now, and most of it's occupied by settlers at this point. The nation's capital is in the middle of their territory. None of their territory has been dealt with by treaty yet. Certainly not a land cession treaty. The Algonquins are party to a number of treaties of political military alliance, but they've never ceded their Aboriginal title.
In, I think it was 1961, Bertrand, the premier before Robert Bourassa, set up the Rapid Lake Reserve as it exists now, 59 acres. All of their attempts to get any kind of authority inside the 6,000 square miles, which they traditionally regarded as their land, were just rebuffed.
When this happened in 1960 or so, there was no consultation then. You just did it. Hydro-Quebec just flooded the land, and who decided these people why they're called Lac Barriere? Algonquins Lac Barriere. They used to live in Lac Barriere, which was their traditional territory. The land got flooded, So who decided where they should move? It was the local priest that decided, oh, Rapid Lake is a good place because it's close to Highway 117. So they never got consulted or anything. They got given 54 acres of land for 500 or 600 people, piled one on top of the other. No hydroelectricity, a generator that makes a lot of noise and breaks down. The whole thing is a disgrace. When you realize that these people sit on a hydroelectric dam down by Hydro-Quebec, and they don't even have hydroelectricity, what's wrong with that? I mean, it's just not acceptable in the 21st century. Hydro-Quebec should fund the new electric line, which will cost $14 or $15 million, to Rapid Lake and bring electricity there, because without electricity, we can't have new housing. So it's a sort of chicken and egg thing. There's so many problems to solve at once. It's a formidable issue.
They never surrendered their Aboriginal and treaty rights. Yet, development was occurring within their territory with the blessing of government, both federally and provincially, in this case the Quebec government. No benefits going back to the community, no jobs, no revenues from any of their resources being developed there.
The real question of the intense poverty in Barriere Lake, I think, has to be asked. I mean, here's a community that's sitting 3 hours away from Ottawa on territory that produces, from the estimates we could figure out, at least $60 million a year in resources. These are the only people living in the territory. There's no white people living in the territory, and yet they're the only ones who don't benefit in any way. Crappy schools, crappy houses, children with no hope. I've seen this in the isolated flying communities up in northern Canada, but these are conditions that exist just up the road from Ottawa.
I got some money from the film board, which I'd worked for, and I'd done various films on the Crees and the Aboriginals before. I just had enough to make a half-hour film. It's not the greatest film ever made, I've got to admit, but nevertheless it states the case for them. And nobody else was stating the case for them, I guess. The whole community came out and blocked a logging road. They couldn't really stop all of the logging that was going on. They didn't have a manpower to do that. But just having blocked this particular logging road, it was on the main road, just off the main road. It was quite amazing.
I want to know what your intention for today.
Well, just be around here. Don't let these guys start.
And what is your right concerning that?
A right to
about
live.
The territory here in the
right to live.
La Vérandrie Park?
A right to live, to have food on the table.
Do you have some paper about that?
We think we could find ways, solutions, by developing a sustainable system which will accommodate all the users in this area.
The land is very important to all users, not only for the Algonquins, it's all users, because myself and some community members were taught that the land doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the generation that's when you used it. So we're there only to protect, so that the benefit will be the same to our children. The land doesn't belong to the government, nor to Barriere Lake. It belongs to the future generation. We're just caregivers as much as the province is a caregiver. They also have to share the resources at the same time to coexist, to avoid conflict in the future.
The Brundtland Commission had written that the indigenous people around the world should be given a decisive voice in any development that takes place in their traditional lands. And it had been endorsed by Brian Mulrooney. If the government endorses it, let's have it. Why don't they impose it right here? So they went along, and that was their idea. And I thought, this is fantastic. Here's one of the poorest groups of people in the country saying to the government, you know, put up or shut up.
We're not talking about dealing with rights to the land. We're talking about food on the table and protecting the natural habitats, the wildlife, which is trying to bring to the Canadian attention that this is a wildlife reserve that they're raping.
Do you have some document to prove you have the right to live here, something like that?
So we've been around here for thousands of years, so that gives us the right to live off this land.
And so eventually the Algonquins blocked the roads, stopped the logging from taking place, and almost forced the governments to a deal with them, which became the Trilateral Agreement, which was based on the concept of the Brundtland Report, which really has for its goal to establish sustainable development. In other words, you can only use natural resources if you're going to take care of these resources so that they will be preserved for generations to come. It's been recognized by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which sat in the 90s, as a model of its kind. It's been recognized by the United Nations as a very forward-looking model. In fact, what it does is to say that the three parties to the agreement, federal, provincial, and the Algonquins, will cooperate to set up what is known as an integrated resource management plan, which is a long-term plan to establish how resources on the territory, such as forestry, all types of wildlife, and all the various resources that come out of it, tourism and everything else, how this is going to be carried out into the long-term future to ensure that the Algonquins get a share in both the management of it, how these natural resources are going to be processed and used, and finally how the Algonquins will be rewarded with a share of the revenues from the resources on their own land.
after a while, they realized the blockades couldn't continue. I mean, it really drains a community. It sucks the life out of a community, and people need to realize that you don't go to a blockade lightly. So they tried negotiating. They tried to find a way to build a plan that would have forestry, have development, but also include them. I guess my feeling after watching this process for 18, it's folded out over 18 years, is that the community went in with good faith, but I think at the end of the day, the government just figured they'd wait them out.
Their education has been mismanaged, and that's a direct responsibility of the federal government. This community had a federal school operating on their reserve, federally administered school until 1995. A study was undertaken because they took over education in 95. Prior to takeover, they had a study done by 2 independent consultants, and the consultants found that their education had been mismanaged by the department, such that there were huge age grade deficits. There basically nobody moving. There was very few, if any, high school graduates, very few, if any, or maybe none, no post-secondary education graduates.
I think people in the non-Native community have no idea that the standards for education for First Nation children are set deliberately lower than provincial standards by Indian Affairs. So even when bands run their own school boards, the funding mechanisms in place basically cripple the children from the start. What people need to realize is that a First Nation community has to meet provincial standards, their schools. Indian Affairs refuses to pay anything near provincial levels. So the size of the schools are smaller, the amount of resources in the classroom are less. First Nation special education funding, and there's great need for special education funding, is tagged sometimes, maybe it's 60% or 50% of what it would be for a non-Native community. So basically they put handcuffs on the community and then say to the kids, now compete. And then when the kids come out of these communities, sometimes to go into high school or go into college, they find themselves 2 or 3 years behind. They start to drop out. And then of course we say, why are the First Nation kids not interested in education? Well, why is Indian Affairs and the Government of Canada not interested in First Nation education?
In 1995, there was a very indicting report on the educational system. Already, even by 1995, the history of relations between Barriere Lake and the Federal Department of Indian Affairs, the regional office in Quebec, was not good. It was friction. They didn't like the idea that this report on education was being released. On exactly the same day that a press conference was scheduled to release that report on education, Indian Affairs issued a press release issued a letter saying they were not recognizing the Customary Council as legitimate anymore. They recognized this interim band council made up of a dissident faction within the community. It's correct to say that the department, if you don't cooperate with them, they will punish you. They get heavy-handed, and they have all kinds of power to recognize or not recognize the council. There was also a lawyer who was acting for the Algonquins of Barriere Lake at that time. His name was Gerard Gay. He'd been terminated by the Algonquins as their solicitor, and made contact with the dissident faction and came to be retained by them. The Barriere Lake Council, Customary Council, had to obtain an injunction to stop him from doing that. But nevertheless, he had enough opportunity to do the damage. And, so you have one individual who has a lot of confidential information, whose role as a lawyer was pivotal. You have major government in Quebec who was opposed to them, and a huge public corporation, Domtar, is big, actually multinational, lots of money, and the federal government, all beating up on one little community who can hardly speak French or English, no money, so it was terrible. decision or the recognition of the interim band council had been based on a petition. All the names collected on that petition were mainly of people who had no connection with the community. There were people on there from California, but they all signed. No connection with the community, no language, no connection with the land. They didn't even have a majority on that petition, but they recognized it because Indian Affairs claimed that that the customs of Barriere Lake had evolved into a leadership selection by petition.
As we never adhere fully to Indian Act system, our leadership is been chosen by the people under the supervision of our elderly people, selected amongst themselves. They select a council of elders to ensure that community members eligible to have a say in our leadership. These people have to be eligible, have to speak the language, and they also have to have a connection with the land, with the community territory, so that they could have a say to protect their interests, as well as to preserve our social structure. Because our community never accepted to go through the Indian Act system to elect our leadership. And that's why our language has survived based on that custom that we still govern ourselves. So those are the things that the federal government is still trying ways to erase that governance system of ours, which was handed down by our ancestors.
The mediator, the Superior Court judge who was appointed, looked into that and said, there's no such thing as a modern custom of leadership selection by petition. And the way these people select their leaders is, in community gatherings. The people who are entitled to participate in this selection are people who have connection with the community, who can speak the language, and the elders have a key role in nominating who is going to be selected. The elders nominate a candidate after having looked at the candidate and having those candidates undergo kind of a bit of an apprenticeship process. They call it wasakigun in their leadership system. They're Anokanagewan. And the report of the judge was that, the interim council is selected. They're not legitimate. These guys are legitimate.
The federal government has treated these people almost as if they are in the colonial empire or something. In 1996, they destituted the band, just like that, on a unilateral basis, because another group came to see the federal government and said, we are the majority, and the federal government destituted the band. Finally, they had to call for a judge of the Superior Court, which told the federal government in no uncertain terms that the decision had been unilateral, ultra vires. It didn't have any justification for it. That they had to revert to the previous council and chief, restore them. This took nearly 2 years to do. The federal government signed a memorandum of agreement, they call it, a memorandum of mutual intent in 1997, when all peace was restored and so forth. In this, it included a recognition that there had been a lot of damage caused to the existing fabric of the community, and that they would pay compensation to the tune of $2.3 million. It's written in the agreement in black and white. They have never been paid. The federal government now says it was purely a symbolic gesture. There was no formal agreement signed. It was purely a memorandum of mutual intent. If the memorandum of mutual agreement had been signed with Power Corporation or Nortel or Bell Canada, can you believe that the federal government would say, oh no, this was purely symbolic, we're not going to pay? They would have said, because they know these guys are destitute, what can they do? They can't afford to go to court, they don't have lawyers, they don't have any money.
That was in '96. Indian Affairs realized that after a year and a half of not having a legitimate council in place and having an illegitimate third party in place, needed to enter into agreements to try and normalize the situation. And one of those agreements was the Memorandum of Mutual Intent, which obligated the government to rebuild the community.
Well, that was 20 years ago, and the trilateral agreement still isn't concluded. So you can imagine how enthusiastic the governments have been about it. Not at all. It's another sad story, actually.
Indian Affairs had a period of time in which the expenditures they made under a third-party manager and an interim band council, all that was highly questionable by an illegally appointed regime. The legitimate council had been denied funding for a year and a half, which is probably in the neighborhood of about $6 million. So the special provisions agreement, which was attached to their contribution agreement, said we disagree on the financial position, and that financial position needs to be negotiated.
The only thing we want is we want them out of here, that's all. That's all we're doing now, is trying to, working our way to get them out of here. Well, first of all, we've been making a lot of noise for us to work with us, the third-party manager, and he doesn't want to work with us. And he just keeps on hiring our dissidents that are causing a lot of problem. What we want to do is like push, we've always been known to push, do things right on the ground.
Yeah.
To block the logging, we've done all that right on the ground instead of going to court. We don't have the money to go to court. It's cheaper to fight it right on the ground. And this is the approach we want to be doing. Not waiting for any court, any federal judges. And I know they're on their side. There was a few years ago when we tried to go to court over the same issue, there was not one federal judge that was going to support us. So I have no faith in those guys. So that's why I don't bother with those. I rather do it right on the ground from my territory here. The thing we like to see, like when we first started off the trilateral agreement, seeing our territory being clear cut. I mean, our hunting way of life is like being down and going down to nothing. And I started worrying what are we going to do to survive if they kill off all the animals. So this is when we start talking and thinking about also including, might as well just use our territory. If it's going to be logging, let them be trained for logging. To run the forest, to take over the outfitting business, the restaurants, that domain, you name it. Those are the things that we want people to train in, to live within to be able to survive within their territory.
Yeah.
So those are the things that we wanted within the trilateral agreement. What we want. In order to start this, we have to have federal government's aid to train people, and this is where we're having a problem with the federal government. They don't want to negotiate with us what we want. So therefore, we're pretty much stuck right now. We have no training dollar. We have nothing to work with from the federal government. No, we don't get nothing out of what they're doing here. You know, the only place we get income is going to be either doing a little trapping, which is not very good because of the too much clear cutting in the past. So sort of reduced down the animals, so that we can't really depend on that. So to me, the only income we really get is like welfare. That's about the only thing we got. What we've been doing is trying to introduce an idea of how we're gonna start ecotourism. But the problem is these guys are all been the French guys, the French citizens, I guess they all got plans over that area too as well, within our area, but where we want to put what we want to start within that area. So it's being all occupied now. I mean there's a bunch of houses like shacks that what the moose hunters use, and they're talking about adding another 800 to 1,000 more around. So they're really developing the area for themselves and really completely leaving us out. Although this accommodation stuff that came down from the Supreme Court,
Yeah, I was going to ask.
and they're still just going ahead making a plan and not even stopping and saying, what do you want to be accommodated with? It's not stopping right now. The only thing we're doing is like doing measures to harmonize them for the logging companies so they can get logged, give them permission to build a house, but there's nothing for us. They're refusing, they're sharing. I mean, there is really completely nothing for us. So that accommodation really is not really accommodating. As they have to really fight to be accommodated. We don't even have enough, according to Indian Affairs, we can't build any more house because our generator over there can't take another house. So therefore, if we want that other house, I mean, we're gonna have to either connect to the hydroelectric, which we can't afford to pay. Well, because a lot of people are on welfare. And that's one thing we don't want. And the government's solution is to raise up our welfare a little bit so we can afford to pay electricity. But that's not what we want. What we want is a job and a better housing. Therefore, there's no arguments, no fights in the future. We're on a 59-acre reserve with no jobs at all. How are we going to pay for the house? How are we going to pay for the electricity? The government told us everybody pays their house across Canada.
Day one of the Canada agreement.
Well, not everybody's on a 59-acre reserve with no land to work with.
No.
Not everybody's in that position.
No.
So right now we're going to be having a meeting trying to find out what the local MPs are doing. From there on, we're going to be pretty much protesting, trying to get things rolling. But we're going to be fighting with two governments. One is the federal government, the other is the province. But right now, the province are having a hard time that they have to create a precedent where they're going to give us 1.5 million, because they think that other Algonquin communities want to want. So therefore, we're going to have to fight the province on this issue. Maybe we might have to stop logging again. From there on, we're going to be making a lot of noise to see the government to make sure that we get what we want. We will not give up.
On all the elements relating to forestry plans, wildlife plans, all these plans, there's no arguments. It's only on revenue sharing because Quebec is scared of creating a precedent. And I've told them, first of all, you have no alternative. There is a formal agreement that you have signed that you would provide revenue sharing. So if you have agreed, you've agreed. So number one. Number two, I said, if you think this is going to go away, it's not going to go away. We're scared of establishing a precedent, but you can't get away from it because this is going to be the pattern. You can't expect that life the way it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago, will carry on today the same way. It's going to change, and justice calls for revenue sharing.
In some ways they are in hardship, but in some way they've got things that are more valuable than money.
We are very fortunate because I personally believe that these youths, they still have something to rely on. It's the land, they keep that connection.
The government put us in this kind of a situation that they should give us an opportunity to build.
Their traditional way of life is probably stronger there than, in many parts of the country. And I think that's a lot harder to get back than money or a nice house. Those things can be built.
We haven't had any suicidal cases despite the struggle, the hardship that our community, the living condition of these families.
If ever they should give us more land for the housing and money and jobs that come with it, then they're going to be together again.
They're so busy just fighting logging companies and governments to try and get a little bit of recognition. They don't have the foundation yet in which they're able to start capacity building because they're so busy fighting, fighting usually with no resources, fighting Indian Affairs and fighting amongst themselves because Indian Affairs promotes that discontent and factions within there,
That's the most important thing. And we're not going to let that, we're not going to give that up. Because I know that's the answer for them to become healthy, to heal themselves, to maintain that connection with their identity, their language. Everything is there. That's the way our ancestors have taught us to know who we are.
I certainly wouldn't advocate that they extinguish their culture or rights because it's strong and they're not going to give it up.
To coexist, that's what we were taught.